Hi everyone. Today I want to talk about political ideologies, what we sometimes refer to as the isms. Liberalism, fascism, conservatism, socialism, etc. This one might be a little longer than other mini lectures, and it's also a bit dense. So follow up, maybe watch it in parts. But let's go. So before we go to talk about specific ideologies, let's talk about the idea of an ideology, right? What is an ideology? An ideology is a set of connected ideas or related ideas, right? That can interact and modify each other. We have a couple of examples here. So for example, if I believe that all people are greedy and untrustworthy, that's at the base of my belief system, then I'm very likely to distrust all elected officials, period. And I would want to carry my own protection. So I will carry weapons because I don't believe that the police will be there to protect me, and I don't trust other people. I will also be willing to cheat on taxes because, again, I mistrust the government, I mistrust all officials and everything that they do. There's no reason for me to pay taxes. Another example is of a person that believes that above everything else we should respect and work for individual rights. Okay? Such a person is more likely to believe that a government, any government, should work to protect human rights in our country and anywhere else around the world. But at the same time, if we go back to this issue of carrying guns, that person would believe that if a person wants to carry a gun, they should. Now, try to see the difference if we're focusing on this idea of guns here. In the first example, I was carrying a gun because I mistrust other people. In the second example, the person that we are looking at may or may not choose to have a gun, but he does not believe that it is a governmental level decision to tell me if to carry a gun or not, right? So the bottom line is the same. We all are, both of those figures would be for carrying guns, but the justification is different. And you can see that there is some sort of a fundamental belief that carries everything else and carries into different policies. Now, we are using, all of you, all of us, you and me and everybody else in the world, we use ideologies as tools that help us to understand and answer every question. And we do that almost unconsciously. When you see a situation, you judge it based on your underlying belief system. And those are cognitive shortcuts. You don't go in case by case by case by case and learn all of the information before making a decision or taking a position. Instead, you kind of try to generally understand what happens, connect it to your value system, and the output is what you think should happen here, right? Now, ideologies are dynamic. They can change based on whatever happened to me or whatever is happening in the world. And they can also evolve. There can be small, gradual changes that are related to whatever is happening, right? Now, the thing is that, generally speaking, we may look at ideologies and say, okay, conservatives are usually A, B, C, D, E, right? Or if we look here at the example, all the rich people will be against taxes. But of course, that's not true. And so we have to be very careful because ideologies can be very messy at times. The political ideologies that we know now, most of them have evolved and developed in Europe during the more or less, from the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, probably 18th and 19th centuries, where you see most of those develop greatly. And they were in reaction to the reality. And the reality in Europe were complex relations that of power and domination that were also static. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you were born as part of nobility, you will always be a noble, and you will always have food and be rich and be able to control what other people underneath you are doing, and vice versa. If you were born as farmers, you had to follow the instructions and rules put by the nobility, and there wasn't any social mobility. If you were born a farmer, a poor farmer, you will die a poor farmer. There is no chance of, gaining education, getting a better job, moving on in the economic ladder of life. In the system of Europe, especially that manifested itself in the 18th and 19th century, there wasn't that kind of option. The relationships were complex. There were different levels, different classes, you can call them, but they were also static. And then we see the Industrial Revolution and development in commerce and trade, and that created a lot more elements into this complex system, but still, for the most part, the relations of dominations stayed there. So this is where we see, and we'll talk in a minute about what came out of that. What was liberalism, conservatism, socialism in that context, right? But if we kind of fast forward, and we'll get back to that later on, at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, because of developments on the ground, you can see all kind of hybrids, like Thatcherism and the New Left and neoliberalism and religious fundamentalism. But let's put those aside and we'll get back to them. Okay, so the first kind of political ideology that we can refer to is liberalism. And here is something that you absolutely have to understand. What we call liberalism in the United States is not the liberalism of Europe. It's related to it, but that's not what it was. In fact, both conservatism and liberalism in the United States are kind of subgroups of the European liberalism. So the core assumption of liberalism that developed in Europe is that all individuals should be able to develop their capacity to the fullest. Okay? And what does that mean if we try to deduce from that core assumption? Is that we need to be able to think and talk freely, so free speech, freedom of opinion, etc. There should be as little as possible in terms of government regulations. So this whole idea of a small government, that's liberalism. And they supported the democracy because, again, we're trying to advance the individuals. Okay? If we go into the US context, the American context, right? So in the United States, what we now call liberalism is the fundamental, we take this idea of developing the individual, take it a step forward to supporting the underdog. And this is why in the United States context, when we say liberalism, we usually mean those things, such as advancing economic equality, care for minorities. It can be ethnic minorities, gender, women, sexual, the LGBTQ questions, etc. Right? And there's also very, very strong support in the US left for freedom of expression. Again, this idea that we need to give the underdog as many tools as possible to speak up and rise up. And the focus on environmentalism. Also, all are related to American liberalism. Now, American conservatism, and this is again, conservatism in the context of the United States, which is a subgroup of large liberalism. Here, we are again focusing on the individual, but we are now shifting away, not looking at the underdog, but looking at self-reliance and trying to keep the government to a minimum. And this is because we believe in personal responsibility and the possibility of people to advance themselves if they just have the opportunity to do that, right? And now you see the minimum regulation on business that come from the Republican Party, this idea of gun owning rights, and that people should consume whatever they want. If you are looking at more recent examples of trying to limit consumer choice by it's not healthy to smoke cigarettes, it's not healthy to drink sugary sodas, etc., and therefore that we tax it and we try to limit it, a true US conservatist would be against that. There is a consumer choice, right? And American conservatism also build on morality and spirituality. So focusing on rights for religious institutions and the kind of all-encompassing idea of anti-abortion, and until very recently anti-gay rights as well, although that has been evolving and changing. So if we look at our initial definition of what an ideology is, in the American context, in the US context, conservatism and liberalism are messy. There's a lot of overlapping, and you can find people a lot of time in a situation of self-conflicting questions because they believe in a small government and government not reaching people on the one hand. On the other hand, they want to limit abortion, which is extremely intrusive on the body of a person, right? So you see a lot of those things coming out. Now, what happened in the United States is that our electoral system, our party system, our two-party system, kind of also squeezed those ideologies into the Republican and Democratic Party, respectively, and created this identification system that is even more messy than otherwise. And at times we see those two parties take on different questions, or taking on the same questions but from different points of view because of how things are compressed and overlap. We will talk more about politics in the United States later on in the semester, but those are some things that you need to keep in mind. Now, to test yourself, you can go in and do this. I would say it will take you 5 to 10 minutes. The politicalcompass.org. It just asks you to interact with a series of statements, and it would kind of give you, based on that, where are you falling on the American political ideological map. It's kind of interesting, and it could also help some of you in completing assignment number 1. So let's go back to liberalism. Remember the European one. The basic idea is that we are strongly relying on the individual and the ability of the individual to develop. what John Stuart Mill, one of the forefathers of liberalism, said is that the chief end of politics is to allow people to become responsible and mature. That is the underlying belief of liberalism, right? So we are going into, we're trying to advocate for full intellectual freedoms, that the government should be small and minimal, and especially when it comes to economic activity, that people should have freedoms to do whatever they want. And we try to break those old-style European ties of domination between owner and worker, right? If you actually want to look at the US experience, what we call libertarianism here in the United States is closer to traditional or European-style liberalism than what otherwise we call liberalism here. And again, conservatism in this context of Europe, 19th century Europe, right? Conservatism actually developed as a reaction to the spread of liberalism. And here the point was that conservatism said that we need not to focus on the individual, but we need to focus on the community, on how everybody will grow and prosper together. And therefore, they are looking for structure, law and order, right? And this is where the reliance on religion and morality, those institutions that already existed in place, come in as well. People are important, but they are important as active and positive members of the community. And they need to fulfill the goals of the community, not their own individual goals. But for most conservatives, the community goals and the individual goals will kind of overlap a lot with each other, right? Power relation, these relations of dominations, elite versus the masses, etc. Those are good. Those are actually bring in more stability. And the reason is that with power, with wealth, with political power, etc., comes a lot of responsibility. And there is a reliance that the people with that power and that responsibility would do the right thing and would work for the betterment of the community. So, kind of by definition, elite are doing the right thing, everybody else should follow them. Now, in the European context, conservatism is actually for the welfare state, for the European model of the welfare state, of free healthcare and free education, etc. Because this relationship, power brings responsibility, and responsibility to the community, and the responsibility to the community is always to help the weak, and always make sure that the community is as strong as its weakest members. And so government plans to help the weak are actually good. Generally speaking, conservatism wants to keep the status quo, and they're not for any change. And if you look at post-World War II Europe, this is where we see a lot of those conservative movements and political parties. And this is also the case in a lot of the developing countries. Now, socialism, and again, we are talking about the European context here, right? So this is kind of a subgroup of liberalism, or it evolved and developed away from liberalism. And the leaders here focused on labor, focused on the working people, okay? And they say, yes, individual freedoms are very, very important. But sometimes, and some individuals need help from the government in order to exercise their freedoms. right? If you are hungry, it doesn't matter if you have a freedom of speech or not. That's kind of what they're saying. So they're not saying get rid of the freedom of speech, they're saying make sure nobody's hungry, and then they can exercise their rights to the fullest. And in this context, we see the rise of Marxism. Do not confuse Marxism with communism. It's not the same thing. Karl Marx argues that society is actually organized by classes, okay? And that the working class, the lowest class, and also the newest class in this context of the Industrial Revolution and the creation of factories, etc., it should be given a prominent role in government. And that if we follow the relationship of domination, of elites always in the elite, and the workers are always the lowest class and don't have a real stake in the system, we will end in a revolution. So Marxism can be seen also as a prophecy rather than a prescription, right? Okay. Communism then evolved from Marxism to be this more militant and less forgiving wing of socialism. And this is what we saw in the context of the Soviet Union and China and Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, other cases. Now, socialism is still in most European countries is mainstream, okay? And it is fine with sharing power between the workers and the owners, and not enlarging the economic gap too much. And again, we're talking about that later on in the semester too, right? And it also has been very strong. Socialism has been very strong throughout the developing world because of that relationship of class relationship. Lastly, in Europe, during the 1920s, we see the rise of fascism. Now, fascism tends to be thin on its philosophical grounds, maybe because fascism rejects deep thought and intellectualism. And in general, what fascism is saying is that we should follow these charismatic leaders. There usually is a charismatic leader. And we are creating this cult of the figure. You look up and you see Hitler or Mussolini or Franco in Germany, Italy, and Spain, respectively, and everybody are following them. They are the one that we look up to. They have the truth, right? And fascism in general rejects any not any in all, but most of the existing institutions. So it can be anti-capitalism, it can be anti-democracy or anti-shared governance, okay, or anti-socialist, and it can also be anti-religion or some culture. So it's usually rejecting whatever is existing and then instead embracing nationalism and this strong leader that has a new message. We are going to change the system. In fact, it's not changing the system, it's breaking the system. It's coming up with a whole new system that will rely on the leader and on nationalism very, very strongly. All fascist regimes have been heavily relying on propaganda, and the large regimes were defeated after World War II, but the movement still exists, right? Even in the United States, we have Nazi. We have Nazi groups, we have fascist groups here as well. But generally speaking, fascism was defeated after World War II. And again, let's jump back to this slide about ideological evolution. We can see how those things have evolved from the European experience and in the American experience. And like I said, after the end of the Cold War, after the fall of a lot of the communist regimes, and as we are adjusting to economic and political realities, we see in the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st centuries, we see the evolution of those hybrids. Thatcherism, which was very compassionate, but also focusing on privatization and trying to push for a small government. We see the new left or the new Labour, Tony Blair and Bill Clinton here in the United States. It's a hybrid. You can't really fit it in any of those boxes. And we see the rise of neoliberalism across the world. China, still very strong, closed political party, no free expression, etc. But they are embracing freedom, free economic activity or free air economic activities. And this whole idea of globalization or globalism comes in with neoliberalism as well, the interventions between countries. And then finally, we do see the rise of those fundamentalist movements, either Islamic or Christian or otherwise, that rely on something else and are a little bit different. They're not quite, they're still could be seen as ideologies, but they're not political ideologies because you can't really argue with them. If they are relying on divine rights or divine orders or divine leaders, for that case, they are different than all the other political ideologies that we are dealing with. All right. So by that, I will end. This has been, like I said, a little bit longer, but I think it was important to go over all of those different isms in one place. And make sure you complete the readings, and I will see you back again on Wednesday.